Grief has a strange way of showing exactly what lives inside a heart, and many believers, without ever meaning to, carry things into a funeral that quietly grieve heaven itself. A tear isn't automatically sacred just because it falls. A custom isn't automatically righteous just because a family has always done it. So what exactly should you never do standing over a casket? What you do in that room, what you allow near that casket, can shape your faith for years afterward, whether you notice it or not. Ecclesiastes 7:2 tells us, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart." A funeral is never just an event on the calendar. It is holy ground. It calls for the same watchfulness you would bring anywhere the veil between heaven and earth feels thin. We're not asked to pretend grief doesn't hurt, but we are asked to carry it differently than people who have nothing beyond this life to hope in. Here are 7 things a believer should never do at a funeral, and why each one matters more than you might think. 1. Never grieve as someone with no hope at all. Paul writes it plainly in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope." I once sat near the front row at a service where a family member folded into a grief that had no floor beneath it, no light, no horizon. It was not sorrow anymore. It was despair, and it filled the whole room. Scripture never asks us to be unmoved. John 11:35 records the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept. The Son of God stood at the tomb of a friend and let the tears come. But his grief was never bottomless, because he already knew what he was about to do. The danger is not the crying itself. The danger begins when a believer's mourning becomes indistinguishable from someone who has never once heard that the grave lost, shaking a fist at heaven, or insisting that nothing means anything anymore. That does not honor the person you lost. It hands your sorrow the final word instead of your faith. Weep fully. Just never weep like the story ends at the grave. 2. Never turn to a medium or try to reach across to the dead. Of everything on this list, this is the one that opens the deepest door. And it happens more often among church-going people than anyone likes to admit. I heard once about a widow, only weeks into her loss, who let a well-meaning cousin talk her into visiting someone who promised to relay one last message from her husband. She was not chasing anything sinister. She only wanted a few more words, a little more closure. But closure was not what walked through that door with her. Deuteronomy 18:10-11 could not be more direct. "There shall not be found among you anyone who practices divination, or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead." This is not a cultural preference from an ancient tribe. It is a repeated command, because God knows precisely how thin the walls of the heart become in grief. Scripture is consistent that the departed are already with the Lord, or already separated from Him. They are not hovering nearby, waiting on a stranger in a dim room to relay a message for a fee. Whatever answers in those sessions is never the one you buried. It is grief being used as a doorway, and the enemy has always known that doorway well. Bring your longing to God in prayer. Do not bring it to a table and a candle. 3. Never let the funeral become a stage instead of an altar. This one hides in plain sight. Grief can quietly turn into theater, where the loudest sob is treated as the truest love, and quiet composure gets mistaken for coldness. Proverbs 14:30 puts it plainly, "A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot." I have watched relatives compete over who gets to speak first, who sits closest to the casket, who is allowed to be the most broken in the room, as though grief were something to be ranked. A funeral was never meant to crown the most convincing performance of sorrow. It was meant to be worship, a moment to face how short life is, and to point every eye still watching toward Christ. The instant it becomes about who looks the most devastated, it stops being sacred, and it becomes a show for an audience that was never supposed to exist in that room in the first place. 4. Never let unforgiveness get buried with the body. This might be the heaviest point of all 7, because it hides so easily behind grief. Families often arrive at a funeral carrying resentments they have nursed for 20, 30, 40 years. And instead of finally releasing them, they quietly convince themselves the debt is now closed since the person is gone. But unforgiveness does not dissolve at a graveside. It hardens there. Mark 11:25 says, "Whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses." Notice the verse offers no exception clause for someone who has already died. Forgiveness was never mainly for the benefit of the one who wronged you. It was always meant to set your own soul free. I think of two siblings I once watched stand on either side of a casket, refusing even to make eye contact, letting a decades-old wound win on the one day it should have finally lost. Whatever bitterness you are carrying toward the one who passed, or toward the person standing beside you at that service, do not let that casket close while the door of your own heart stays bolted shut. The debt you refuse to release does not stay in the ground. It follows you home. 5. Never trade Christ for a ritual, an object, or a superstition. Nearly every culture wraps its funerals in tradition. Specific items placed inside a casket, candles arranged a certain way, small rituals believed to settle a spirit or guarantee its rest. Colossians 2:8 warns us to see to it that no one takes us captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. Many of these customs are not neutral background noise. They quietly teach that what happens to a soul afterward hinges on something the living get right, instead of resting entirely on what Jesus already finished at Calvary. That is a substitution, and it costs more than most families realize. A soul's destiny was already sealed the instant its last breath left the body, decided long before any candle was lit or trinket was set beside it. You can still honor your family's heritage without letting a tradition quietly replace the gospel at the exact moment your family needs the gospel the most. 6. Never let gossip travel through the gathering. Funerals have somehow become one of the easiest places for whispered judgment to spread. Corridors and parking lots turn into echo chambers of quiet speculation. Did anyone actually find out how it happened? What was really going on behind closed doors in that marriage? I never trusted that side of the family anyway. Proverbs 11:13 says it directly. Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered. James 1:26 adds that if anyone thinks himself religious and does not bridle his tongue, his religion is worthless. I have heard of a grieving widow who overheard exactly the kind of conversation, never meant for her ears, turning the single worst day of her life into entertainment for someone standing 20 feet away. That is not merely thoughtless. It is cruelty dressed in condolence. A funeral is holy ground, and a tongue that wags there is not honoring anyone who has died. It is disrespecting the God who hears every word spoken in that room. 7. Never walk away from a funeral without asking whether you yourself are ready. Of all 7, this last one may matter the most. A funeral is one of the rare places where eternity refuses to be ignored, and yet so many people leave that same building just as hardened and just as distracted as when they arrived. Ecclesiastes 7:2 reminds us again that death is the end awaiting all mankind, and the living are meant to lay it to heart. That means a funeral is not simply an event to check off. It is a mirror held up to your own life. Psalm 90:12 prays it this way, "So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom." Every service you sit through is really an open invitation to ask, honestly, whether that casket belonged to you right now. Would you face eternity unafraid? Walking out thinking only about traffic, or lunch afterward, or getting back to normal life wastes one of the clearest reminders God ever hands us. Do not walk out unchanged. Let eternity's weight settle on your chest and let that weight carry you nearer to the foot of the cross. A funeral is not an obligation to check off a list. It is a rare appointment where the space between heaven and earth grows thin. Hold on to these 7 truths, and your mourning will carry more hope. Your family will feel more honored, and the ground you stand on with God will feel far more solid the next time you find yourself facing an open grave. If this reached something in you, pass it along to someone who will need it before their own next service. And if biblical wisdom like this matters to you, stay close to this channel for more. Down in the comments, tell me this. I choose hope over despair, and I will face every loss ahead with discernment as an act of obedience to God.